Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Really pleased to come and talk to you today. What I was going to talk about is how Warwick and Stratford District Councils are responding to the climate emergency. And I think before I get into the presentation, it's worth me saying that up until April, my role was covering both councils. And so, you know, I was able to sort of speak about what's going on within both councils. Since April, I'm really pleased to say that Stratford District Council have appointed a climate change project officer, who is Eleanor Warren, who's on the call today. So Ellie may well want to sort of say hello during the presentation, and I'm sure she'll correct me if I am a little bit out of date for anything I say about Stratford District Council. So, you know, I will cover what's going on in Stratford as far as I know, but it is worth saying that, you know, Eleanor is the person that's sort of more in touch with it and is very much sort of picking up the reins from me. I should also say, though, that the two councils are still very much working closely together on the climate emergency work. So we still have a joint climate change action programme. The two teams, Eleanor and the Warwick team, meet on a weekly basis together, so that we're making sure we're coordinating our activities. And we still have a range of joint projects that we're doing that are managed across the two councils. So whilst it is really great that Eleanor's on board at Stratford, I don't want anybody to leave with a signal that that means the two councils are going off in their separate directions. I mean, clearly there are two new political administrations at each council, and I guess it's early days in the sort of lives of those administrations, and you know, I don't want to I don't want to suggest that well, I don't want to close the door on the possibility of those administrations making a choice not to work together, but certainly all of the indications I've had so far from the new politicians, and certainly our intention as officers, is that we will continue to work really closely together on the climate emergency work. And I think there are real benefits in doing that, because it's an area, clearly a topic that cuts way across the boundaries of individual districts, and obviously way beyond that as well. But also it allows us to use our resources more efficiently, allows us to do things like bringing in contractors that can work on behalf of both councils across a large geographical area, and so on. So yeah, something that we're keen to do. So I just wanted to say that by way of introduction. So I'll start sharing my screen now. Hopefully this will work. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay. Okay, so some of these slides, apologies if you've heard me talk before, I'm just going to run through some slides which you've probably, you may have seen before, but I just wanted to give a little bit of context. So the first sort of 8 or 9 slides are perhaps ones that some of you will have seen before. And then I wanted to go and drill down into one particular theme about work that we're doing, which is around new build housing, and about how we're tackling that through both the planning system and through, in Warwick's case, through the new housing we're doing. And then also touch on 2 other themes as well, which is around transport and what we as district councils are doing, bearing in mind that the county council is the transport authority, and also tree planting and what we're doing around that theme. But you know, clearly can't talk about absolutely everything, but I'm really happy to pick up anything else that anybody's interested in the questions at the end as well. So just as a reminder, the 2 councils have both declared a climate emergency, and in 2021 set out these 3 ambitions for the work that we're doing around the climate emergency. So first of all, to become net zero carbon council by 2025, although it's important to note there that where we're talking about contracted services, it's net zero by 2030. And that's to take account of the fact that services like providing leisure centres, waste collection, those sorts of things, we do need time to work with the contractors to decarbonise those particular services. Ambition 2 is about low carbon South Warwickshire. So that's about reducing carbon emissions across the whole of the geographical area of Warwick and Stratford by 55% by 2030, with a view to that being a significant step on the way to becoming net zero by 2050 in line with the national targets. So the 55% reduction is ahead of the national commitments, but clearly only takes us some way towards where we need to be. That 55% recognises that we as district councils can only do so much. We don't have the powers to do everything we might like to do, so it's about trying to galvanise our local communities, our businesses, and of course play the part, whatever part we need to ourselves to reduce carbon emissions across the area. And then the last ambition is perhaps less well defined on here, but it's about adaptation. So recognising that whatever we do about preventing carbon emissions, we are going to see climate changes taking place, and those climate changes are going to impact on South Warwickshire. Last summer was a really great example of that, where we saw record high temperatures, and we have previously seen flooding events. We've previously seen high winds and storms and so on. And the predictions are that those sorts of extreme weather events are going to become more frequent, and it means that we need to enable our environment, our communities, our businesses to adapt to those changes. Now, the scale of the changes will depend on how successfully we are internationally with the mitigation, with preventing carbon emissions. But we're planning for something that could be as high as a 3-degree rise, which would have really quite significant implications globally, and would certainly see very, very significant weather pattern changes locally too. So if we're focusing on reducing carbon emissions, we need to be clear about where those carbon emissions come from. So the two councils commissioned an organisation called Anthesis to do some work for us around that back in 2021. And this graph is a summary of a very long report that they did. I think that the key things to sort of pick out from here are the most significant areas of the dark blue wedge towards the bottom left of this diagram, which is around on-road transport. So that makes up about 45.3% of carbon emissions arising from South Warwickshire. And then on the opposite side of that, you've got three wedges, which are a sort of orange to peach kind of colour, which are residential buildings, commercial buildings, and institutional buildings. So buildings, in other words, which make up around 40% as well. There are other significant areas, particularly around aviation, livestock, and industrial processes. But you're seeing there that if we're going to focus on carbon emissions that arise from within South Warwickshire, big areas have to be around transport and buildings. I won't dwell on this because this is very much internal stuff for the two councils, but it's just worth saying that we're really conscious about the need to put our own house in order as part of this as well. We've got a long way to go. Our house isn't completely in order yet, but I think we are making some progress across both councils in terms of decarbonising our buildings, using renewable electricity sources, incentivizing staff for active travel and low carbon travel. And as I mentioned earlier, working with our contractors. So for instance, all of our new contracts have carbon reduction plans associated with them, with targets built into them that we expect the contractor to comply with. And there's associated penalties if they don't. So we meet with them on an annual basis to review their progress. But more importantly, with our contractors, we work in a very collaborative way, in a partnership way, to try and resolve areas with them that are where there are really significant carbon emissions. So the refuse collection vehicles or the energy used in leisure centres, really good examples of that. And we're engaged with the contractors on both those things, having conversations, albeit we still need to turn those conversations into really hard actions that make a real difference. So yeah, those are important initiatives that we're doing within the councils and with our contractors as well. What I did want to focus a little bit more on is about what we're doing to achieve that, work towards, or hopefully achieve the 55% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050. Now, I've already said that I'm going to drill down a little bit more into the stuff around planning and buildings, around active travel, and to a degree around domestic energy as well. But it is probably worth just talking about the energy efficiency side of things, where in buildings, where it relates to retrofitting the existing buildings. So there's lots we need to be doing about new buildings. We know we're going to get lots of new buildings built, and I'll talk about that. But where we have a bigger challenge is around the existing building stock within the area. So we're talking about, gosh, how many homes are across the whole of South Warwickshire? It's something in is it 80, 90,000, maybe 100,000 homes that we're talking about, plus of course all of those commercial and institutional buildings that we have across the area. Now, both councils have been very successful in receiving green homes grants and distributing those green homes grants to residents. So for instance, there has been a scheme recently called Local Authority Delivery 2 and then Local Authority Delivery 3, which has enabled us to give grants to those homes that have a low EPC rating, environmental performance certificate rating, energy performance certificate rating, sorry, and where the occupants earn below £31,000. And so we've done some very, very targeted work to provide grants, well, or to directly fund measures to improve the energy performance of those homes. So the sorts of measures that we've been introducing through those grants include the introduction of solar panels and new heating systems, mainly air source heat pumps. But probably more importantly than that, it's been about improving the fabric of the building, so the roofs, the walls, and making sure that they are as thermally efficient as they possibly can be. So there are hundreds of dwellings across both districts which have benefited from those grants. But I'm using the word hundreds there in the context of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dwellings altogether that need to be retrofitted. So it shows, whilst we are getting grants that are literally millions of pounds for each grant, the cost associated with doing the retrofit for all of the homes across South Warwickshire is astronomical. So the only way we're ever going to be able to fund the kind of decarbonisation measures that are needed for all of those homes is if people are able to spend some of their own money, and not everybody can afford to do it. and that's where we need to continue to get the grants, and it's where we continue to need to support people. But for those that do have sufficient disposable income to spend on their homes, I think it's really important that we as councils give people the confidence to spend that money wisely. And I know from my personal experience how hard it is to get really good advice about the most effective things to do in your home. And even if you know the most effective things to do, to get contractors who you can really trust to do that. So we want to try and crack that nut. And one of the initiatives which we're just launching at the moment is what we're calling the Able to Pay scheme, which we're doing in partnership with Act on Energy, who will be able to, we'll provide a phone line service for people who want advice on how to decarbonise their home. But more importantly, for a lot of those calls, there will be an opportunity to get a retrofit advisor to come out and have a look around your home and to give advice as to the most effective things to do. So if you've got £1,000 to spend, you could do measures 1, 2, and 3. If you've got £5,000 to spend, you can do measures 1, 2, 5, 7, 8, 9. It's that sort of advice that they should be able to give. And we're hoping that Act on Energy will also, in those cases, allow the home or put the homeowner in touch with trusted providers. There is an issue which is a really tough nut to crack in all of this, which is that there is a limited supply of tradespeople in South Warwickshire to do the sorts of work that we want to do. It's really tough sourcing those people who can do the work, and some of the lead-in times are long, and that makes some of the costs expensive as well. Behind the scenes, and this is something that we haven't started yet, but behind the scenes we're really conscious about the need to work with local colleges and other training organisations to try and build that capacity within our local area as well. So it's a really, really important area. It's not one I'm going to say any more about now, but I'm happy to sort of talk about that in the questions. Community, commercial and institutional buildings. We have provided some, we have done some workshops for businesses, and those workshops, this is through an organisation called Sustainability West Midlands. And those workshops have focused in on how businesses can decarbonise their buildings and their processes as well. I was disappointed with how well those are attended. I think it's going to be quite a challenge to get, for us as a district council, to get those messages across to the range, or the full range of businesses in the district. And we really do need to be working with the kind of representative organisations, let's say. So, for instance, the BIDs, the Business Improvement Districts, or the Chamber of Commerce, or the local Federation of Small Businesses. Those sorts of organisations have a key role to play, and our economic development teams are in touch with them and very much sort of conscious of the need to get decarbonisation messages across. But it's not an easy area to get traction in. So other initiatives, it's about renewable and low carbon energy that we're trying to sort of build within the area, so that we in South Warwickshire are playing our part in that renewable energy provision for the whole of the country. Controversial areas to step into, because solar panels, like the picture shown there, do have an impact on the local landscape, and do have an opportunity cost in terms of what that land might otherwise be used for, whether it's for food production or ecology, or things like flood prevention and so on. But having said that, some of those things can sometimes be combined, and there's a trick to explore there. We are, as part of the South Warwickshire Local Plan, doing piece of work at the moment, which is looking at rural land use to try and make sure that we've got the right policies in South Warwickshire local plan to encourage solar and other renewable energies where it's appropriate to do so, and to protect things like natural carbon stores, or to protect ecologically sensitive areas, or indeed areas which could provide important ecological connections. So it's trying to get that balance right about how we use the limited amount of land we have in South Warwickshire to the best effect, and to help with the issues we have around the climate emergency. There's a whole issue there around farming and food production that I don't want to get into in this conversation. Very, very controversial, very difficult to deal with, and not one that the district councils are actively engaged with at the moment, but are conscious of in terms of being part of the bigger picture. But yeah, as I said, we don't want to get too far into that one at the moment. The diagram at the bottom that says hydrogen hub on it is just an example of the sort of thing that the district councils could actively get involved with. So as well as renewable energy, we need to think about how we decarbonise some of the most difficult parts of our local economy. So that's like the heavy goods vehicles which are currently operating on diesel. They've got big weight, big distances to cover, and can't run on electricity. If we can have local hydrogen production, which certainly Warwick District Council is very keen to try and do, we can help provide or help encourage the conversion of those sorts of vehicles to hydrogen, and at the same time actually help with our refuse collection vehicles. So hydrogen is an example about how we can both help the local economy but also decarbonise our energy use. Actually, I'll skip over that one. That relates back to the earlier slide I showed about what the district councils are doing to decarbonise themselves. And you can see that there has been a reduction in 2021-22, that's meant to say. And we do monitor it on a regular basis. I think we're going to have to look very closely at the following years to see whether that reduction continues. But we're conscious that the decarbonisation of our own buildings does take some time and does take a while to feed into the stats. But I'd like to think that we're beginning to see that the impact of our actions taking shape there. I've mentioned earlier about adaptation and wetter winters, more intense storm, drier summers, and so on. What we're doing on this one is trying to take a risk-based approach. So we need to understand what are the real risks to our local area if the climate changes in the ways that are predicted. So, it's about impact on habitats and species, soil health, which could be damaged by either drought or by, flooding events. And linked to that as well, the carbon stores that we have in the area could be depleted as a result. We've got risks to crops and livestock and to food production, of course risks to the local economy as well, either because of the extreme weather events themselves or through related things like the risk of power system failures, which you can obviously get when you get extreme storms or flood events and so on. And really importantly as well, risks to human health and well-being. And we saw some of that last summer in that really hot weather with people, particularly elderly people, and other vulnerable people in really quite difficult situations where they weren't able to go out, and impacts on their well-being as well as their physical health. So Warwick District Council has responded to some of this by holding a series of team workshops where we've had some really fascinating conversations with people who are providing frontline services, whether it's our green spaces services, planning, or people in housing who are going out to who are providing sheltered accommodation, those sorts of services, or whether it's emergency planning as well. And it's thrown up a whole range of things that we need to think about differently as we plan our services in the future. Some of which are really quite straightforward changes. Some of it's a change of mindset, some of which are really expensive and really quite difficult and long-term things that we need to be working towards. So the sorts of things that we are beginning to work on is where we're doing tree planting, we're really thinking about ecological resilience, and we're also thinking about how tree planting can help with things like flood prevention or soil health and those sorts of things. Planning of new buildings, we're beginning to think about how we can ensure that cooling systems are taken into account or built into the design of new buildings in a way that doesn't lead to additional carbon emissions. We're thinking about resilient green spaces, so how we encourage the plants that we have in our green spaces to survive, but more importantly, how we make sure that those green spaces are a key part of the local ecosystems that need to have as much green space to enable those ecosystems to be resilient themselves. And interesting ones around things like community safety, where last summer in the heat wave, we've had a lot of open water swimming, we had real significant fire risk, and the council actually next week will be putting some signs back up in all its parks again because of the long, hot, dry spell we've had, to say no barbecues. The big risk of fires, and we saw that in other places last summer. Fortunately, we didn't have any serious events locally, but a big risk around those sorts of things, about how we actually manage those. The bottom one there about partnerships with Severn Trent Water is that's just one example of the sorts of partnerships we need to build up. But we're working with Severn Trent Water on a multi-million pounds scheme, tens of millions of pounds investment in Leamington to separate surface water drainage from foul water drainage. And we've heard this on the news so much over recent months and years about how when we get flood events, we're seeing foul water being washed into our rivers. And this is all about separating out those two systems so foul water doesn't get washed into our rivers, or it doesn't happen so frequently, by including some holding tanks and separating out the historic sewer systems that we have in some of our towns. So we're helping that by actually a lot of those works taking place in Warwick District Council land, and the Severn Trent working very closely with us on that sort of thing. So that's the end of the sort of general part of what I was going to say. Janet, I'll take advice from you. Would you like me to carry on with the theme about new housing, or do you want to take a pause there and take some questions on what I've said so far?
What do people think? I mean, possibly it's best to let you get to the end of the presentation, do you think?
Okay.
Yeah, and then we'll have all the questions.
I'm very happy to. It's just
okay, we'll do that.
The sound of one voice going for too long, I didn't know whether it would, people would like a break, but that's absolutely fine.
Okay, thanks.
If you'd like to do that. So as I say, first theme is new housing, and I won't go through all the slides on this, but just as a reminder, residential buildings make up about 20% of the carbon emissions across South Warwickshire, and there's a real chance that that will grow because we're going to see, and we're going to see a lot more new housing built across South Warwickshire over the next few years. So our existing local plan in Warwick District has 17,000 new dwellings to be built, and those are being built at the moment. And Stratford District's plan has a similar number, slightly lower number, but it's likewise a lot of new homes being built. In Warwick's case, and I think it's true in Stratford's case as well, there was an intention in the local plan, the current local plan, to include a sustainable buildings policy. We were trying to build a policy around code for sustainable homes. We got a letter from the government saying we weren't allowed to include that policy, and the planning inspector was therefore basically had to strike the policy out of our plan. It was really unfortunate, and the consequences of that, I'm afraid, are what we're living with now, because the homes that we're seeing going up around us, in the main, don't have, they don't have the kind of thermal efficiency that they could do. They don't include air source heat pumps. They don't include rooftop solar. So we're really missing an opportunity. So it's an issue that we really do need to crack. I should say that since Warwick District adopted its local plan, and indeed Stratford District adopted theirs as well, the government now have reopened the door to have those sorts of policies included. So it was a temporary constraint that we had to live with, and we're now back in a position where we can include it. So these are pictures from new homes around the area, and you can see that new homes going up, no sign of any solar panels, and I can assure you that they're all gas heating, and that they have thermal measures which comply with the 2013 building regulations, but not with real modern sort of thermal efficiency standards that could be achieved. So that we're tackling in Warwick, we're tackling this issue in two different ways. One is through planning policy, which I'll talk about in a moment, but the other is by setting an example with the houses that we are building ourselves. So we have an aspiration to deliver around 2,000 homes by 2030. That's part of meeting the local housing need, particularly affordable housing. But it's also part of the way we can set that example for how low carbon homes can actually be built. So we can deliver these homes in a number of ways. One of the ways we really like doing it is through joint ventures with private house builders, and through, and the third bullet point there, through purchasing homes via Section 106 agreements. And the reason we really like doing those is because we can work directly with house builders who are active in our area and show that it can be done. So I'll talk a little bit more about those sorts of things in a moment. But where we're doing direct developments ourselves, and Warwick District Council has a couple of direct developments planned in Kenworth, we want to be exemplars, so that those developments are building homes to the highest standards possible in terms of carbon efficiency. I'll skip that one because I've probably already covered it. I think, well, yeah, except I'll come back to this point about upgrades for I think actually, hold on. Yeah, sorry, I've got a slide that covers that later, so I'll come back to that one. So the second way we're addressing this issue is through planning policy. So we weren't able to include it in the local plan. That would have obviously been the best way of doing it. So we are now taking an approach which is a bit of a sticking plaster. It's kind of patching up a wound that we'd rather not have had, but at least it's taking a significant step forward, even if it's not getting us all the way to where we wanted to get to. So we are in the process of adopting a net zero carbon development plan document. So this version that's on here was a consultation draft from last year, but we now have had an examination in public with an inspector who has said that on the whole, he's happy with the document. He wants us to do some modifications to it, which we're just about to consult on. And once those modifications have been confirmed, we can adopt this policy. And what the policy, and what the policy does is take a developer through 3 stages really. The first is to say, if you want to build a new house in Warwick District, the first thing you've got to do is minimise the actual energy demand that that house is going to make. And it does that through thermal efficiency, you know, good quality insulation, the roofs, walls, windows, doors, those sorts of things. So that's the first stage. The second stage is you have to use zero or low carbon energy sources, preferably energy that is produced on site. So rooftop solar being a really good example of that. But there are other sort of energy sources that would be acceptable, such as district heating schemes or some kind of ground source heat scheme that heats a wider area of buildings. Or, you know, there are some places, not locally, but some places up in the northeast that are using hydrogen heating systems, those sorts of things. So if through 1 and 2 the home doesn't achieve zero carbon, there is then a carbon offsetting requirement. So we've done that in a way which is a gold standard offset that's the developers are required to follow. So we think they'll be paying around something like 240 or 250 pounds per tonne of carbon. That's a lot of money per tonne of carbon. And the reason it's a lot of money is because we don't want them to do this. We want them to solve the problem through steps 1 and 2, if we possibly can. Having said that, they may not always do it. And if they don't do it, then they will pay the district council whatever the carbon offset rate agreed through the development plan is. We will then use that money to fund a local carbon offsetting scheme, which the county council is setting up in parallel with this. And we've been working very closely with the county council, which really is based around what the county call natural capital. And by that, they really mean, you know, actually spending that money on offsetting carbon through planting and through improvement of sort of natural resources that capture and retain carbon over a long period of time. So there's a lot of work that's going into the sort of standards. So as I say, the aim is for that to be a gold standard kind of carbon offset. So it's not about going to spend £20 a tonne on something that is going to be used overseas and can't be locally verified, if you like. So really important that takes place. Coming back to the standards that the council is doing for its own development, its own developments. We're in the process of developing what's called the Warwick Standard, and on here are some of the principles of that Warwick Standard, and we're hoping in the autumn to actually take that standard for formal adoption. That's not to say we're not already doing some of the things, but what we have been doing, and I'll show you in some of the slides, is trialing out a few things on some of the local developments that we've put in place, so we understand the real intricacies of what it means to be an organisation that builds low carbon homes, understand some of the pitfalls for what it means for the residents who live in them as well. So it's been quite an interesting learning exercise for us. So some examples, this is Turpin Court. It's not yet on the ground, but what we discovered in designing this is that, you know, there's a lot of prefabricated stuff that's gone into this, and it actually works really well. It's quite cheap construction, but we weren't able to build the block on the left there single story because I can't remember the specific constraints, but there was issues about the thermal efficiency if that went to additional stories. But it includes air source heat pumps, photovoltaic panels, and is, as you can see there, ECP A+, so it's very, very energy efficient homes. And that's going to be developed quite shortly. I think it's 9 dwellings. This is an interesting one. The Waverley Riding Stables in Covington, where we're developing these 17 dwellings directly and achieving zero carbon based on SAP. Now, that's an interesting issue because it is zero carbon based on the SAP stands for, gosh, somebody help me out here, I don't know, but it's basically the way you measure energy performance through things like building regulations. What it doesn't do is measure the energy performance on the ground when it's actually implemented. So one of the issues that we need to think about with a scheme like this is how we actually measure what is built on the ground, because the construction of it could impact how energy efficient it is. So that's the performance gap type issue. And then I mentioned earlier, we really like doing work with housing developers. So in Radford Semley, there are AC Lloyd, who's a local house builder. We've been working with them and have taken on the affordable homes on their scheme. And as part of that, we have got them to upgrade their usual building standards for the homes that we're taking on to include increased U values, solar PV, air source heat pumps and so on. Not necessarily reaching zero carbon because we're still adding these on to their basic building design. But what this is able to demonstrate to AC Lloyd is these things can be done and they do make a difference to the energy performance of those buildings. So they're actually delivering these things themselves for Warwick District Council, but the homes that they're selling onto the market don't include those features. So it's quite an interesting thing that actually the higher performance energy buildings are the affordable homes. And it's a similar story at the triangle on Europa Way in Warwick. And I don't know if any of you ever drive along Europa Way, but if you're heading in towards Leamington on Europa Way, you come to a roundabout about halfway along Europa Way. And if you look on the left, there's a whole there's a new development there, and quite a few of those homes have solar panels on the roof. So the picture on the bottom left there. And it's been quite interesting, the feedback we've had from some of the local communities saying, well, why are all the homes sort of fronting onto Europa Way? Why are those market homes all got higher performance than the social homes that you stock at the back of the site? And actually, it's completely the other way around. That it's the homes that the council has been influencing the developer to build that have got the higher standards. And anecdotally, I haven't had a conversation with them myself, but I understand that some developers in the area, as a result of schemes like this, have turned around and said, we wish we had done what you've done in the council. It's a shame they didn't. I think we all wish they had done, but they are at least learning from what the council is doing, and hopefully we're influencing what they do. It's far from perfect what we're doing. We don't want to hold up as being that this is we've got it sorted, because we really don't have it sorted. We've got some real tough nuts to crack. Embodied carbon, by that I mean the carbon that is held in the building materials, so to make a brick or to make a tile or to make some glass for a window, all of that takes carbon. So you've got that carbon sort of stored up within the building. At the moment, we're not doing anything that takes that into account. We'd really like to see that addressed through future buildings so they're genuinely zero carbon. In the main, what we're doing is about regulated energy. So by that, I mean the energy that can be controlled through building control. So the heating, the amount of heating that's used, or the amount of electricity that's used for lighting are examples of regulated energy. Unregulated energy is the fridge that we might buy and put in our home, or the laptop that I've got plugged in now. We can't regulate how much energy people use for those sorts of things. But that's still energy that's being used in homes, so it's not true net zero living unless you start thinking about how you can deal with unregulated energy, and some local authorities are beginning to get to grips with that as well. This doesn't deal with the retrofit of the existing housing stock. This is only new build, and we've already talked about how the majority of the homes we need to tackle are the ones that are already here. And nor does the sort of standards that we're currently working to at the moment deal with that adaptation issue that I talked about earlier, although that's certainly on the list of things that we want to sort of build into our standards. So that's coming. Again, I could pause there, but I'm conscious of time. I'd probably just talk about the transport theme and then stop. But this is a much quicker theme than the housing one I've just gone through, so I'll stop in that in a few minutes. But it's just to say that whole area around transport is a crucial issue. County Council are really key partners in resolving the transport issue, but we recognise as district councils we also have a role to play around transport. So there's some examples here. Warwick District Council has a scheme called Better Points, that logo at the top, which is an app that anybody can download onto their mobile phone, and it earns you points for every mile that you use using sustainable transport. So if I cycle into town after this meeting, I'll get some better points, and I can then use those better points to trade in at local shops that have signed up to the scheme as well. So it's a real incentive scheme, and we want to really try and grow that, both in terms of the number of businesses that are involved, but also the number of people that are using it. At the moment, though, it is ring fenced to Warwick District. So if you're in Stratford District, it's not currently active there, but that's a discussion that we're having at the moment to extend it across the whole of the area. The bike in the middle is an e-cargo bike that is in Stratford District, and these are really aimed at local businesses who want to move things around using a bike instead of a van. And this is one, but there is actually a larger e-cargo trike as well that's available. And again, we're really keen for businesses to sign up to using these. There are bikes available that can be used for 3 months for no cost at all, or for minimal cost. There is some insurance cost, but otherwise minimal costs. We're interested in bringing in a bike share scheme, like the top picture on the top left. We've been a little bit shocked by how expensive that's going to be, and we're therefore looking out for potential external sources of funding. But I think providers are quite clear that a scheme could work in Warwick, Leamington and Stratford, and we'd be really, really keen to do that, thinking of the tourism in Stratford, but also the way that Warwick and Leamington work as towns, and the student population and so on in Leamington. It could work really well. Co-wheels picture there. Not some, well, it is there is a co-wheels car share scheme up and running in Leamington. So this is a scheme where, rather than buy a second car or even a first car, maybe for some people, you can actually book the use of a vehicle at the times when you want to use it. We'd like to extend that to be electric vehicles, and we'd like to extend its reach and the number of vehicles available, because it's not got enough resilience built into it at the moment. So we're working, well, we're starting, not really deeply into this work, but we're starting to work with Co-Wheels and other potential providers to look at how we can bring that into the area. Could work really well in rural areas, but I do know it's really hard to make it stack up financially in some of the rural areas as well. Electric vehicle charging is a crucial one, and we have introduced some electric vehicle charging across South Warwickshire. We really do need to improve the infrastructure for that. And there is a procurement process just they'll be kicking off shortly to try and bring in some a new partner to work with us on electric vehicle infrastructure for the district council car parks. Hopefully can also support parish councils as well. It's not going to tackle on-street charging, in other words, those homes that are terraced and don't have their off-street, because that's something the county council will be doing in parallel with us. So they're working on that element of it. And then the two pictures on the bottom right are cycling through our parks, and again, something that we're really keen that our open space is a part of the active travel network that we have. So the top one there is St Nicholas Park in Warwick, which has just seen a major improvement to the cycle path. And the bottom one there is Abbey Fields in Kenilworth, which I think it is actually, I'm not sure, it doesn't look like Abbey Fields. Anyway, it's meant to be, it was intended to be Abbey Fields in Kenilworth. Where there's some real controversial issues about how we introduce a new cycle path into that area. Lots of tensions about other park users, about the historic monuments that are under the ground and so on, but certainly an ambition that that becomes a key part of the network, but just a demonstration of how difficult some of these things can actually be as well. I'll stop there and come back to you, Janet.
Thanks very much. That was a really helpful and informative presentation, I thought, Dave, and I'm sure there are lots of questions. So I've just put my view on gallery so I can see everybody. And if you want to ask Dave a question, maybe if you put your electronic hand up or just wave at me, and then I can see who wants to ask a question. Any questions from anyone? Okay. Hello, Stephen. Go ahead.
Hi. Thanks, Dave. A lot of really interesting information in there, and it's good to get some details of the buildings that are being built now. I'll just say I don't agree that there's a trade-off between farming and solar panels. As I said at a recent council cabinet meeting, you know, if we don't install solar panels, that's going to mean that the planet heats more, which is going to take its toll on agriculture. And the real land hogs, I think, are biofuels and animal agriculture. So I think that's where the trade-offs are. But the question I was wanting to ask is kind of sort of themed. Just reading the March update on the climate action programme, there was something that caught my eye, and there was the council, Stratford Council, had been planning to install solar canopies over the leisure centre car park. And in the more recent update, it says that due to practical implementation concerns, at present there is no further activity planned for this scheme, which I find a little bit disappointing. So I was just wondering if you could give us a bit of an update as to what's gone wrong there.
Well, nothing strictly speaking gone wrong. So there was a bit of work done, a feasibility study done to consider whether it's something that it was something worth looking into more. There was never a specific intentional commitment to install the solar panels, but the commitment was to undertake the feasibility study. What came back from the feasibility study was that yes, it looks like it could be something there, but there were a number of specific actions that needed to be taken before it could be confirmed whether this was something that could really work in reality. So, for instance, you know, the feasibility study didn't consider the planning issues in any way, so it would need planning permission, some of these things. It didn't consider you know, the real practical stuff about how vehicles move around the car park and those sorts of things. It also acknowledged that there were a lot of trees in the Stratford Leisure Centre car park, and there needed to be some kind of work that, well, some work done to look at how the solar canopies and the trees could be mixed in together. The issue that actually prevented work being done, further work being done there, was about the coach park at the back of the leisure centre and the access to the coach park. Now, I don't know the details of that because I wasn't involved in the work, so don't ask me what particular turning circles were issues, but actually getting coaches in and out of there was thought to be a real issue. What is still a possibility, because the study also looked at the potential for solar panels on the top of Bridgeway car park, and I know from conversations I've had that that's something that the council may want to sort of pick up from that initial feasibility study and still look at. But again, you know, I'm not up to speed on exactly where that's got to.
Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. Adrian.
Thank you very much. Really interesting presentation. And it was interesting in that I can see much more about the complications and the difficulty of implementing what some of us might think would be rather straightforward measures. So thanks for that. I'd like to know, is the able to pay scheme already active? Sorry, and my other question is there any prospect of a vehicle scrappage scheme?
Okay, so on the first question, I think if you phoned Act on Energy now, they would certainly help you. I think the able to pay scheme is about to sort of take on its full shape over the next sort of weeks and months, because it's about recruiting some of the staff that need to go out and do the assessments and so on. So I'm not entirely sure where they've got to with their Act on Energy have got to with their contractual arrangements with the people who are going to do that side of things. But I think it's pretty much ready to go. But certainly, if you phone them now, they would certainly they would certainly give you that initial triage advice, if you like, about what might happen next. So yes, to an extent, but more to come soon, I think. The scrappage scheme's not something I've been involved with at all, or have any clear views on. So I'm going to duck that. I mean, did you have anything particular in mind, or any reason why you were asking around that?
Well, I drive an old diesel, and I'd like to consign it to scrap, but I can't afford to front up an electric car.
Mm.
So, you know, some kind of assistance would be a great encouragement.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I mean, I drive an old petrol car, and the view I've taken is that because of the carbon that's involved with actually building the vehicle in the first place, I don't want to scrap that car until it comes to the end of its useful life, really. Because, you know, whilst I might be able to get a cleaner, greener car in operation, it's not actually going to help me reduce carbon emissions overall. I know less about what the impact of diesels are, but certainly from my petrol car's point of view, I'm gonna keep it going for the time being, and just use it as little as I possibly can.
Well, there's the computation about carbon and so on, and then there's the actual tailpipe emissions and the need to reduce those as fast as we possibly can. So it's a difficult one for me.
Yeah, it's not something I know about or has been considered by either councils.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks. Olivia's next, I think.
Hi, David. I've got a couple of ones. Brilliant to hear about the net zero carbon development plan document that's happening in Warwick. This may be a question for Ellie as well, but how close is Stratford District to adopting this, or have they started drafting something?
Yeah, Stratford's got a slightly different starting point in that their existing local plan has a little bit more on climate change than Warwick's, which means that they've been able to do what's called a supplementary planning document, which is the next tier down from Warwick's development plan document, but it allows them they actually have quite a strong checklist of things that they expect developers to do around climate change and building standards and so on. So in some ways they're ahead of Warwick, in the sense that they already have those policies in place. In another sense, they're behind Warwick because they're the next tier down in terms of the type of document. They carry a little bit less teeth, and it's a little bit harder to make the developers do it. So don't think, as far as I know, Stratford District Council haven't got any intention to do the same thing as Warwick, but the two councils working together on the South Warwickshire local plan have every intention to do the equivalent to Warwick's development plan within the South Warwickshire local plan, and much more as well. So, you know, there's a real commitment in both councils to make sure that when that's published, it's got real teeth that go that really do get to that net zero carbon.
So have they used that supplementary planning document to enforce developers to put in sustainable policies?
I'm sure they have. There will be circumstances where I'm sure they would like to have done and it doesn't do what they would quite like it to do, but there will be other times when I'm sure they have. But I haven't been involved enough to be able to know for sure, or to give you any examples.
And my one other quick point was in that document that you showed, is there, it's a travel question as well, linking housing to active travel instead of, is that, and I'm guessing that's an intention, rather than all housing developments being funneled onto main roads and then all pedestrians and cyclists having a
it's a really good point. That's not touched on in that document at all. It is something that the South Warwickshire local plan has to get to grips with in a way that is much better than in the past, and we need to see the county council join us in that as well. So I think both district councils are committed, and I think through the new local transport plan the county council have produced, there's a much heavier emphasis on active travel and buses and public transport generally than there has been in the past. So I think the signs are good that we'll be able to do that much better than we have done in the past.
Okay, thank you.
Next, we've got a question from Paul.
Hi, yes, thanks very much. Thought I'd welcome Ellie to Stratford. I know you've been there a while, but it's good to hear we've got our own person as well. The question, though, for Dave is the new regulations. I know Ellie's just posted a link to the Stratford building requirements, so maybe Ellie could answer as well. But when will the councils be starting to enforce the new powers that they have just been allowed in building regulations?
Oh, on building regulations. I'm actually not sure, but I think when the building regulations, when they're published, that's when you start enforcing. One of the issues that we always have when new building regulations come in is that there's often historic building regulations for large housing sites. If you've got a site with 500 houses on it, they often get building regulations at once, but the developers will spend 5 years building those 500 houses. And you can't retrospectively apply the new standards. So you still see homes being built that don't meet the new standards. But, it should be from the day that new regulations come in. So I think, was it Part L that was published earlier on this year? I think that's now in operation. But I don't know which specific part you're referring to, but we start enforcing them as soon as they come in for new proposals.
Yeah, I was just talking about the you were saying the council were prevented from enforcing rules, and then now you've got a new release.
Okay. Yeah, I was talking about that was a planning policy. Yes, yeah. The difference is blurry, but yeah, the building regulations are imposed on us nationally, and we have to enforce them. Our local planning policy that we were prevented from bringing in back in 2016, and we're now trying to bring in 2023. We'll start implementing it certainly from the date it's adopted, which will be in hopefully October. But actually, if the consultation that we're about to start is uncontroversial and the inspector is happy that the changes that he wants to be made can be made, we can maybe start in using it even before it's adopted. So it'll be soon. I would not before August, but certainly before October.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks. John's next.
Thanks, Janet. Hi, Dave. I'd like to reiterate what Stephen said about solar farms and this issue of land use. The fact is that using land to grow animals is a very inefficient way of producing nutrition. In the case of beef, if you use the land to grow wheat or similar cereals, you get 6 times more nutrition in terms of calories and protein per unit area. So for people who are worried about that, the answer is to just eat less meat, because then there isn't the demand for so many animals, and there'll be plenty of land to build solar farms. And it is a question of perspective. 0.1% of the UK land is currently used for solar farms, and the ambition is to raise that by a factor of 3 to a whole 0.3%. 28% of UK land is used for raising animals. So you only need to take a little bit of that to provide space for solar farms, and a little bit more to grow some cereals to replace the nutrition that's been lost by pinching that first bit for solar farms. So, you know, the facts are plain, and we need to get this message out. Part of this is for the council to encourage people to eat less meat, and then there'll be plenty of space for solar farms. You mentioned the bike scheme, which you said was very expensive. What sort of number is very expensive? Is it tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions?
I think that the what we looked at was extending the West Midlands cycle scheme, which already comes down into Warwick University and through Coventry and so on, and it was going to be about 1.3 million.
Right. Okay, so thanks for that. So it is quite a lot of money.
Yeah.
And then on the question of low cost carbon neutral homes, I recollect that it was either Swansea or Cardiff University built 2 small homes within the normal budget for that size of home, and they were either 0 carbon or very low carbon. So the technology exists to do it. So the developers need to be made aware of this and maybe put in touch with how this university did this, so that they can learn how to do it without radically increasing the cost of the home.
Thanks, I wasn't aware of that one, so that's
Yeah.
useful to know.
It was some years ago, so I probably can't find the reference to it, but I've probably thrown away the Energy Institute magazine which recorded it. So yeah, that was several points, so thanks for listening, and thanks for a very interesting talk.
Pleasure, and I hope you don't mind if I don't comment on your first point. Just it's not something either council are working on at the moment, but just that it is quite a controversial issue, and I won't comment on it. I really appreciate what you've said about food production and so on. That's really helpful.
Thank you.
Thanks. So Claudine is next.
I've actually got a question actually about, again, heating, district heating networks specifically, thinking about, so development of new housing, absolutely, that is covered, but what about existing housing stock, which is the bulk of it? Could you tell us, I believe there's been some feasibility studies on district heating networks, and seeing what has happened in Cornwall with Heat the Streets, which is just, you know, you've already got existing infrastructure as your road infrastructure that already has a multitude of services in there. Just wondering whether that's been explored and whether it's of interest to Stratford District Council or Warwick District Council.
Personally, I don't know the Cornwall example you're referring to, but you're right, Claudine. We have looked at 2 district heating schemes for Warwick and Leamington at least, and I know Stratford are looking at a district heating scheme for the canal side area as well. The issue with the schemes we looked at in Warwick and Leamington was about the heat source and about having an affordable and renewable source of the heat that we could then distribute. Both of those initially looked at water source heat, and I don't think that was probably the right track for us to go on. And I personally still think there's a real potential for district heating scheme in central Leamington, and potentially it's it's something that we could implement. I think where we do need to do more on district heating, and this relates again to the local plan, is on new housing. And I know that's not what your question was about, but I think there's some real opportunities to identify heat sources across South Warwickshire and to make sure that new homes are located in places where they can take advantage of those heat sources. But yeah, I haven't got enough knowledge about the example you talked about from Cornwall to comment on that, but I'd be interested to hear more.
Then in which case, it's just I have certain parishes in mind and aging housing estates that have been rather broken up. So if you're thinking 50, 60 houses, what put me in mind was listening to Act on Energy's presentation a few months ago, and just the fact that they are prioritizing certain housing. And of course, that's absolutely right. But the vast expense of doing one house at a time in isolation across the district, as opposed to perhaps taking one street at a time. And I will certainly send over that example, because if it applies in rural Cornwall, it occurs to me that perhaps rural Warwickshire is not so different, but I'll send over the example.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claudine. Richard.
Thank you, Dave. The transport section, I realise you were a bit pushed for time. You didn't mention public transport, especially the role of buses. Now, I appreciate that it's very much a county council issue, public transport, but I would hope that the district councils are pressing the county council for improvements in bus services. Very important, not just for the here and now, but it may reduce the amount of road building that takes place in the future. Do you have anything to say about that?
Two things. I mean, you're right, it's county council who need to lead on that, and both councils did lobby quite strongly for ensuring that public transport was high up on the sort of hierarchy of transport options when county council consulted on their local transport plan. So I think it's something that we do want to see as well, and I think we're pushing an open door with the county council at the moment. The only thing that we have done to influence public transport use is the Better Points scheme that I mentioned earlier, and colleagues are working with Stagecoach to actually include Stagecoach as one of the incentives that people can get. So if you use public transport, you build up your Better Points, and you potentially get money off your public transport season ticket or whatever. I don't know exactly what the incentive would be. So we can actually help with that sort of thing by liaising with local bus providers. And I suppose there's also something through the planning system that we should be doing as well, and making sure that we sort of incorporate good quality and sustainable public transport on new housing schemes as well.
Would the scheme you mentioned apply in Stratford? Because I think it's only in Warwick.
No, not yet. Not yet, but it's definitely something we are talking to Stratford.
Good, thank you.
Thanks for those questions. Before we finish, I'd just like to ask Eleanor if she wants to introduce herself and just repeat Paul's welcome to Stratford to Eleanor, because we're very glad to have you as our own climate change officer.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Sorry, I'm aware I've been quite quiet this evening, but I've only been in post for a couple of weeks, so I've just been kind of bringing myself up to speed on everything. So I'm not sure I could have added an awful lot of value. I don't know if it's useful just to give you a little bit of background about kind of where I've come from, but I was at Stafford Borough Council before as climate change lead, which is where I live, and decided it was time for a change when I saw the Stratford role advertised. So I've got a kind of background in biodiversity, climate adaptation, planning policy, and decarbonisation generally. So really excited to kind of see what we can do in Stratford. If anybody has anything they want to chat about, I'm more than happy to talk about anything really. So happy for my contact details to be shared and for you to get in touch as and when you like. So that's me. I'll shut up now.
Well, thanks very much, Eleanor. If you want to put your contact details in the chat, that would be great. Thanks. And I'm just going to stop the recording.